千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. Previously, I brought up the fact that there's a chapter title, and this is something that we're doing relatively recently, talking about the Chinese title that can sometimes provide additional insights into a particular chapter of the Tao Te Ching. In this particular one, it has two titles. The title that's being translated is The Well-Established. 善建者. That just means the Tao practice that is well established. It's a reference to the practice in the Tao. The alternative name, as you see in the parentheses, 善抱者, that is to establish and embrace or to hold, and it's referring to the same thing. Establish a practice in the Tao and embrace the teachings of the Tao, or hold on to the teachings of the Tao, referring to the same thing. In particular, this chapter is going to present a view of the Tao in terms of cultivational practice and also an expanding circle of influence, an expanding sphere of influence. So last time we started out with the analysis of the original characters to identify where the sectional breaks ought to be. So as you can see, we have 4 sections. The first section, the introduction, is all about the establishing and holding on to the Tao. We were able to get to the beginning of line 3, and we'll pick it up again after a quick recap of what we had talked about before. Today's recap is actually going to be especially important because I want to illustrate how the linkage works from one chapter to the next. But staying with just the sections for now, in section 2 of this chapter, as you can see in the slide, it's all about cultivation, and it's talking about different levels of cultivation in yourself, the family, the community, the country, and the world. So we'll talk about exactly how that works in a moment. Then, in the third section, now it's talking about observation, 观. So this is the Tao practice of detached observation, very important in the teachings of the Tao. And here, it's also talking about the same 5 levels that we just saw in the second section. Yourself, your family, your community, your country, and of course, your world. And then section 4, the last section, is just the conclusion of this particular chapter. And this is similar to the conclusion that we had in chapter 53, in that this is a strongly worded, emphatic ending to the entire chapter. This is a way of the ancient sages to project certainty, project emphasis. You know, this is what I want you to know. This is what I need you to pay attention to. So that just underscores the importance of this chapter as well as the previous one. So let's do a quick review of what we talked about last time. And I mentioned that this is important because I want to use this opportunity to illustrate how one chapter can lead into the next one. And that's where the skill and knowledge comes in when it comes to the Dao De Jing. Oftentimes, I see the Dao De Jing chapters explained in isolation of the other ones, when in fact, the way that it was written, it was oftentimes depicting a continuous train of thought. Previously, we talked about the right path. When we discussed the right path, I also mentioned this slide that you see. This is the right path from a Buddhist rather than Taoist perspective. This is what was taught by the Buddha. Roughly 2,500 years ago, at the same time that Lao Tzu lived, except that the Buddha, the original Buddha that founded Buddhism, lived in India, very far away in ancient times because of geographical distance. So the two did not know about one another, Buddha and Lao Tzu. It was only much, much later on when in ancient China there would be fusion, synthesis, encounters between the two great traditions, Buddhism and Taoism, Buddhist teachings and Tao philosophy. So now, with this particular slide that we talked about last time, because our subject was the right path, how do you figure out what the right path is in life? So in Buddhism, the answer is what is known as the Noble Eightfold Path. In Chinese, 八正道, it just means the 8 right paths. So the translation into English is really adding more to it than was in the original, maybe as an attempt to dress it up. This happens all the time. So even something as well known as Sun Tzu, the Ancient Art of War, the original title has no art and actually has no war. So the translation dresses it up to make it seem more than what it actually was in the beginning, and possibly to make the classic a little more attractive to a new readership in a different language. So back to the Noble Eightfold Path. What do we talk about? Well, the 8 right paths, as you can see, that we went through, was all about right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So this is a common way to dispense, to disseminate Dharma in Buddhism. Things are spelled out and given to the followers. So there's nothing wrong with this particular approach. It's a list of one item after another. And this is what I characterize as sort of a one-dimensional way of looking at life. That's it. This is the list. That's all there is to it. The advantage is that this is easy to understand, easy to follow, and this is suitable for an audience that will simply do what it is told. The Tao is a little different. The Tao concept, the Tao paradigm, the thinking is that all of us studying the Tao, we all have to do some work. We all have to figure out stuff for ourselves. So things are not as spelled out as they tend to be in the Buddhist practice. We have to use our brains and figure it out. So it's no longer one-dimensional, as I characterized before. In the Tao, being a little bit different, not spelled out, not handed to you, because Lao Tzu tended to think ways that are more multidimensional. Why is that? Well, because life, reality, and existence, these are all complex, multidimensional things that we encounter and deal with on a daily basis. To make the Tao more in accordance with reality, with everyday life, Lao Tzu would sometimes take a slice from the complex overall structure and highlight that. So even when it's a travel-based metaphor, we talked about previously how the Tao, meaning the way, is depicting this journey. It's a travel-based metaphor, the life journey. Even when it is that, there's still more than one dimension to it in the way that Lao Tzu taught. So let me talk about the right path from the Tao perspective that we studied in 53, and then I will illustrate how to link that to the paradigm that we're using in 54. So that's the reason why I'm using this recap to do that. This is a value. This will illustrate the way that thinking is done by Lao Tzu, and the thinking that when we gain the right level of skill, we begin to think in the same way. So chapter 53, the right path. What I have done is that I've positioned the original text to the left and the right, and I want to use that to accompany the illustration of how this works, this multi-dimensional view. In this case, it's going to be an extra dimension. So all the texts in red are basically counterexamples given by Lao Tzu to talk about what not to do and how not to be, which in turn tells us what we should do, how we should be. So let me give you an example. In the beginning of 53, it says the courts are corrupt. So this is the ancient metaphor where the courts being corrupt leads to a whole bunch of negative consequences, negative effects. When we look at a metaphor like that, there are two things that we need to do. Number one, we have to recognize that Lao Tzu is using a metaphor to talk about life. So in this case, basically, Lao Tzu is saying, well, listen, your life is your kingdom. You are the ruler. If the ruler is corrupt, it's going to lead to all kinds of bad things in the kingdom, which is, again, your life. The second thing that you have to do in your mind when you look at this example, these counterexamples from Lao Tzu, is to recognize that Lao Tzu is talking about the wrong way. So if you reverse them, you end up figuring out what the right way is in life. So the courts being corrupt is the first example. Then when we do that mental translation, we figure out that, oh, well, this is actually about life. That we don't want to live our life that is straying away from the Tao, hence being corrupt. So what we have to do is to live one's life with integrity. A life that is without the negative kind of chaos that corruption can bring. It's an orderly, balanced, and harmonious kind of life. So that is the first step in what Lao Tzu would call the right path in life. Lao Tzu then says, well, the courts being corrupt leads to the fields being neglected. The farmers are not working the fields because of the corruption from their rulers. Again, we do that translation. This is really talking about life. The fields worked on by the peasants, that's really talking about the work that we have to do in life. So then to reverse that, if we're able to live life with integrity, then the right path in life will lead naturally to us doing productive and positive work. And when I say work, I mean your chosen field of work, whether it's your career or maybe personal projects, something that's meaningful to you. And when you're able to do work meaningfully, productively, you get results. The negative counterexample is that when the fields were neglected, it leads to the warehouses being empty. So there's cause and effect that we're looking at here. Corruption in the courts, leading to the fields not being worked on, leading to the warehouses being empty. Reversing that, the right path, living life with integrity, leads to doing productive and meaningful and positive work. And that in turn leads us to an abundantly filled warehouse, which in our case just means that we are in a position to receive abundant prosperity. So that right there spells out cause and effect, one after another, one leading to the next. So it is again the travel metaphor. So you get a starting point, you get some kind of a way station, and then a destination, meaning like a goal. So you can think of it as, well, what if I start out in San Francisco and I want to travel southbound, passing through Los Angeles to San Diego. So that will be the travel-based metaphor. So I mentioned that this has one extra dimension, and that was definitely in chapter 53. So Lao Tzu talks about how the corrupt officials wear fineries, and that's a metaphor for putting on a false facade or projecting a superficial front. The reverse of that is that in life, one has to be authentic. You have to be genuine. Cannot be superficial. Don't be, quote unquote, don't be phony, don't be fake. Gotta be real. This is actually related to the first item on the left that you see there. When you live your life with integrity, with self-honesty, that is the very definition of being authentic, being genuine. So the two are connected, so the arrow goes in both directions. So the items, the dimension on the right-hand side is not so much like a travel-based metaphor where you lead from one to the next. They're connected only by the order that Lao Tzu talks about them. So being authentic and the next item, collaborating with others, one doesn't lead to the other. They are independent. They can happen at the same time or at different times. The second one is where Lao Tzu talks about the corrupt officials carrying sharp swords. That's a metaphor for intimidation, domineering approach to your interactions with other people. The reverse of that is to get along with everyone, to work together with them, to collaborate in the spirit of harmony. You can see now that it's easily connected with the second part of the right path, to do productive and positive work. Obviously, they're linked. And then the third thing that Lao Tzu talks about is overindulgence, overconsumption by the corrupt officials. The reverse of that is that if you want to live your life right, you can still enjoy all the good things in life, but you want to do so in moderation. That obviously is interconnected with the third and last part. The full warehouse, the reverse of the empty warehouse, means that your life is full of abundance, prosperity, and goodness. things to enjoy that you enjoy in moderation. Now you can see how this other dimension feeds into the first dimension. And then there's one more thing that Lao Tzu talks about, and that is hoarding excessive wealth. The opposite of that, the reverse of that, is to be able to share your resources, be able to help other people. This is in the spirit of compassion. So not the same as everything that went on before. It's a separate thing, it's independent, but it is definitely linked to the last part, the full warehouse, the warehouse full of abundance and prosperity. Now you can see, as I do, how everything makes a beautiful kind of sense. Everything is linked together. Everything is a structure. There's more than one way to look at a situation because that's exactly how life is. So now let me illustrate how this is connected with what we're going to talk about today in 54. It's yet another different way to look at it. So it's no longer the attributes of each way station in the journey. It's a different view. So the title for this slide, 53 to 54. So I want to start out with a travel-based metaphor and then show everyone what it looks like when you look through the perspective of chapter 54. And it starts like this. The starting point in this travel-based metaphor is that you get your car. So here, let me just tell you about a friend of mine. I'll call him John, not his real name. So John is a big fan of comic books and science fiction, same as I was, especially in my teenage years. So John and his friends want to go on a trip to Comic-Con, this vast convention with all the celebrities, all the previews, all the exciting stuff. So they make the plans, and John gets a car. He has to carry a lot of his friends, so he gets an SUV that seats 7 people. He's got 6 friends that he wants to drive from San Francisco to San Diego. So then the starting point is the basics. He gets his car, this rental SUV. He's not familiar with it, but he can drive. So he drives it around, picks up his friends. He picks up 2 friends in San Francisco. Then they drive. They drive down to Los Angeles, where they have 4 other friends that they pick up. So the circle of influence in the Tao practice here equivalent to the number of people as passengers in the vehicle goes from a few people picking up the people and the friends in San Francisco to picking up more people in Los Angeles. So halfway point in this case is Los Angeles, picking up more people, meaning now the car is nearly full. And the influence of the Tao cultivator is expanding to include more people, positive effect on more people. This is also a message to all of us that it's not enough just to mind our own business, that we have an obligation if we see something that is working, if we have ideas and concepts and understanding that we can share with others, we should. So continuing with this metaphor, arriving at the destination, San Diego Comic-Con, where John and his friends meet up with all of their other friends from out of state. That's even more people, and that's destination. So by now, their group is dozens of people. It starts with just one person, John, continues adding 2 of his friends, 3 people now, then picking up more friends. Now it's an SUV full of fans. Then arriving at the destination, meeting a whole bunch of other people, dozens of other people. Now, let me point out one thing. The left and the right, the diagram on the left and the diagram on the right, it's talking about the same journey. It's just a different perspective. It's just a different way to look at that same trip. So in chapter 54, we're transitioning from the travel-based metaphor of 53 as a metaphor to the expanding circle of influence that you see on the right. But I think you can see what I'm driving at. Whether we talk about it one way or the other way, we're talking about the exact same Tao as before. The exact same thing. The same life journey that we're all engaged in right now. So last time, here's what we talked about. We went through lines 1 and 2. Line 1 is about that which is well established cannot be uprooted. So the practice, the Tao practice that is well established is compared to a plant that has taken deep roots. It cannot be uprooted. Then in the second line, that which is strongly held cannot be taken. This is continuing with that same idea that strongly held beliefs in the Tao cannot be taken away from you, because just like the tree that's taken deep roots, it cannot be uprooted. So when we talk about this, this is a common theme for the ancient sages. They oftentimes talk about planting, using agriculture-based metaphors to make themselves easy to understand, comparing the mind to a vast field where you can plant whatever you want, and therefore what you plant should be chosen with care. These planting, unlike a physical crop, these are intangibles. Here I'm using a picture of a tree that has roots reaching deeply into the ground. And this is my way of showing that, thoughts can be very powerful. They can have lasting effects in life. And thought patterns, if you think about how they persist over time, especially thought patterns that you share with other people when you explain how some things work, your ideas and your concepts, your notions get transmitted from you to another person. They in turn can convey that same understanding to even more people. So, quote unquote, tell a friend. The more people are aware of the ideas embedded in the Tao, the more lasting those ideas become. In time, when thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people become aware of the Tao, it becomes truly lasting. It cannot be destroyed. It cannot be taken away. So, Tao practice taught by a master to many disciples, that practice becomes very durable in time, becomes very lasting. It's the same way in the other part of the metaphor. A physical object can be taken away from you by force, but cherished memories, deeply held beliefs, or your faith, these are not physical objects. There is nothing for another person to grab onto and wrest away from you by force. So an example is that someone who's going through a tough time in life, but persevering, sticking through it, a lot of gumption. And this is because of a deeply held belief that things are getting better. Things will turn a corner, that perhaps things have already hit rock bottom. There's nowhere to go but up. So these are all beliefs that you hang on to that cannot be taken away, and they help you through the challenging times. Because of this, because of the power of the intangibles, whether it's a practice, whether it's cultivational, whether it's beliefs, memories, ideas, concepts, notions, all the intangibles are actually quite powerful. So that's why we have to be so careful in planting thoughts, concepts, ideas, notions that will take root in the mind. So Tao masters would sometimes use stories to illustrate this exact point. One such story is called The Weeds. So I'd like to share that story with you. Especially meaningful to me because it's included in the Tao of Wisdom. The idea behind the Tao of Wisdom is that there are so many stories passed down since ancient times that illustrate the wisdom in the Tao Te Ching. So I think it's a fun idea. I think it's a lot of fun to collect those stories together to illustrate the different chapters of the Tao Te Ching. So I've chosen, 20 plus of the best ones, and The Weeds is one of them. It's definitely one of my personal favorites. So some of you have already seen this book. Some of you have gone through it. Some of you have not. So let me share the story with you, one of the many, called The Weeds. This goes back to once upon a time in ancient China. There was a sage. He had 3 disciples. So they all worked together, studied together at a remote temple. Once every few months, they would travel from the temple into the nearest town to purchase supplies. So one day, on one of these trips into town, they passed by a field that was overgrown with weeds. Now, the sage looked at this and thought that this is an opportunity to discuss the Tao, because the Tao, after all, is in everything. So the sage turned to his disciples. He said, this field can be compared to the mind. What we plant in the mind are ideas and negative thoughts that's been planted in the mind are like the weeds that you see here. So tell me, what do you think is the best way to get rid of the weeds, to clear the field? So the first disciple was quick to the answer, beating the others to the punch. He said, well, master, we just pull up the weeds with our hands. That's easy, right? What can be easier than that? And the second disciple disagreed with the first disciple. He spoke up and said, well, no, that's not effective. I mean, this field is pretty big. And so look at how many weeds there are. You can only do so much of that pulling with your bare hands before you get tired. You gotta use tools, like maybe a shovel. You can do more in less time. So you can save yourself a lot of effort by doing it with intelligence, with the right tools. Then I mentioned that there were 3 disciples, so there's a 3rd disciple. He was the slowest to answer, but then he said, no, I disagree with both of you, because even that is not effective enough. Look at how big this field is. Even with a shovel, it's still going to take a long time, hours to clear this field. It's still going to be exhausting. Whether you do it by hand or by a shovel, same thing. I would say the best way is fire. What you do is that you set up a perimeter around the field, and then you start a fire to burn the whole thing. It'll take time to prepare such a perimeter to make sure that it is safe and will contain the fire. But once you've done that and you get the fire going, burning the weeds, you just stand back and watch. You don't have to, it's so powerful, you don't have to do the work yourself. The fire is going to do the work for you. So that's got to be the best way. So with these 3 very different answers, the sage approved. The sage said, well, all of you gave answers that are quite different, all equally interesting. Now tell me, how does your answer correspond with the Tao? After all, we studied the Tao. Everything that we talk about, we want to connect it back to the Tao to see if we can uncover some sort of universal principle. Again, the first disciple was the quickest. He said, I would say my method, pulling up the weeds with bare hands, is the Tao, because it's like confronting each negative thought in the mind directly, getting a hold of it and having the satisfaction of yanking it out, uprooting it from the mind or the field. This is the Tao in the most basic, most fundamental level. So he was happy with that analysis. The second disciple thought about this and then again disagreed, just like he did before. He said, well, I mentioned that the field has too many weeds to clear by hand. It's the same with the mind. If you think about the mind, there are so many negative thoughts that if you want to eliminate one by one, that's going to take quite a while. You need tools. With a field, I said shovel. With mind cultivation, it's the tools of Tao cultivation, like meditation, mantras, reading sutras, memorizing sutras. Think about it. These spiritual tools are standard for a reason. They're standard for us. They're also standard for other cultivators. So isn't it obvious? My idea, using the right tools, is much closer to the Tao. Let me pause here and ask you guys, what do you think? Think about, as you follow the story, think about it like the disciples and the sage. What do you think the third disciple would say? As you would probably expect, he disagreed with the other 2. He said, no, my method, the fire, it is the most powerful and therefore the most similar to the Tao. The Tao is all powerful. My method, using fire, is like establishing communion with the gods and the Buddhas. Burning the field with fire is like using the sacred power of the divine. You sweep the mind completely clean of negative thoughts. The power of that makes it the closest to the Tao. So he sat back and he too thought he had the best answer. So all of them thought they had the best answer. And you may have a different opinion. You may root for a different disciple. But here is what the sage said. He again approved of their answers. He said, these are all quite valid. Now, we're going to continue on our way. So he actually decided to not reveal what he thought. He said, we're going to continue on our way, but I want all of you to remember this discussion that we just had. Think about your solution some more. We'll come back to this. So then months passed, and soon it was time to go on the supply run again. So they took the same path as before. So again, they passed by the same field, just like before. This time, though, things looked different. They saw whoever owned that field had turned it into rice paddies. Seeing this, the sage turned to the disciples and he said, "This is the reason why I did not name one of your answers as the right one. Because none of you actually touched the level of the Tao." So the disciples were confused and said, "Well, Master, what was wrong with our solutions? They seem perfectly reasonable." The sage pointed out, well, they were reasonable, but they were all temporary measures. What you described were all correct, and yet they were temporary, not lasting. The Tao is that which lasts. The material world is that which is transient. So in your answers, after you're done with any of the methods that you named, by hand, by tools, by fire, after a while, you know the weeds will grow back. The only way to ensure that won't happen is to replace the weeds with something else, like what you see right in front of you, the rice crop. So even then you have to maintain it, but the right crop in the field will help prevent the weeds from coming back. So in a similar way, it's not enough just to eliminate negative thoughts from the mind. You also, at the same time, have to plant the seeds of positive thoughts. That's how you make it last. That's how you make sure the weeds do not return. So I can see that many of you are definitely thinking along the same lines as the sage. That's great. That's the Tao. Once it's explained, even if it did not occur to you before, I think you would agree with me that it seems simple and obvious. And that's how a Tao story should be. So then let's review. What did we talk about? First of all, the common practice in the Tao that the disciples have referred to, there's introspection. What this means is that you think back on the past to review your thoughts, your words, your actions. You make sure that what you have done, what you have said are all in accordance with the Tao. That's one of the practices common in Tao cultivation. Another one, also very common, reading. That's to absorb the collective wisdom from books and sutras. So this is also something that's widespread, and this is something that can bring people from not knowing a whole lot about the Tao to even participating in a meeting like this. Then there's, of course, meditation. In meditation here in the bullet, you see passive and active forms. I want to point out that meditation includes not just sitting meditation, which is the passive form where you keep still and you eliminate, you let go of all thoughts, all grasping attachments to enter into the trance-like state of the meditative mind. but there are also active forms. Those of you who have taken up Tai Chi or Qigong, Tai Chi is Tai Chi Quan. Qigong, these are movements, these are motions. But the idea is that these can be meditative movements. You can have your body in motion while your mind remains tranquil in a meditative state. There's also contemplation, and this is when we talk about communion with divine avatars or virtues at the lower level, at the beginning level of cultivation. People think of it as prayers. I pray to a particular deity. I pray for strength, for wisdom, for virtue to help me cultivate. I use the term communion because it's closer to the essence when you get to a higher level, that you are communing with the avatar or the representation of a particular virtue that you wish to manifest in your life. So these are all common practices in the Tao. So the well-established Tao, in our analysis, what the sage pointed out is that you can do the above, but they do not last. You also have to do more. The lasting Tao is to plant the seeds of goodness. So not just reviewing your negative actions and words, but also practice compassionate actions, speak compassionate words, and so on. You have to make that part of your cultivational effort to let the positive take root and displace the negative. Now, over time, the good news is that the effect lasts and it's completely natural. So I want to offer you this story as a way to illustrate what it means to have a deeply rooted Tao practice. It's a Tao practice that requires maintenance. It's Tao practice that requires the positive side of life that you want to manifest more and more, and then using that to help you continue on and help you handle incoming negativity, adversity, challenges, difficulties, and so on. We are now past the first couple of lines. We're now focusing on line 3. Line 3 says the descendants will commemorate it forever. So let me pick out a couple of characters. The first 2 characters that you see there, 子孙, 2 characters. The first one is child or children. This is the same character as 子 in Laozi, but whereas in Laozi it means master, here it means child or children. Then we have 孙, which means grandchildren, grandchild or grandchildren. When you have the 2 together, 子孙, what it means is all descendants in all future generations. This gets brought up, especially in a work like this, because in Chinese culture, there's a great deal of emphasis on the family. And the emphasis is from the past to the present to the future. To the past, it will be the ancestors. The present is yourself and your family. Future, well, descendants, future generations. The Chinese perspective on this is that you are right in the middle in this incredibly long chain through time. There's those that came before, there's those that will come after. So you between the two, between the past and the future, what you ought to do is, first of all, venerate the ancestors. I'll have more to say about that. Veneration here, it means paying proper respects. So I'll get into that just a little more. Venerate the ancestors, and that's for the past. The future, pave the way for future generations. So you see this quite a bit in the Chinese family and extended families, where the older generation will work really hard to provide for the next generation so that the next generation can have the education and the opportunities that was denied to the older generation. So that's all coming from the same paradigm. Let's pick out a couple more characters to illustrate. Here, we're talking about ritualistic offering to honor the memory of events or ancestors. So, ritualistic commemoration here is oftentimes something that is misconstrued, misunderstood as ancestor worship. So think about where you see people from Asian descent burning incense and then praying to ancestors. Oftentimes misunderstood as a kind of worship. So ancestor worship becomes a term. Now, let me talk about the reality rather than the misconception. What the Asians do when they burn that incense, when they pray to the ancestors, it's not really religious worship. It's not like religious worship. It's more of an expression of gratitude. So this is sort of an opportunity for us to clear up this misconception. The idea is actually simple. It's something that we can all relate to. It is about remembering where you came from. Never forget where you came from. Always a good thing. So here in this line where it says the descendants will commemorate it forever, Lao Tzu is trying to say that if you establish the Tao in your family, it will benefit all future generations, and therefore your descendants will commemorate it forever. Commemorate the establishing and holding on to the Tao. So in that context, I think you can see that gratitude makes a lot of sense. You know, remembering where you came from, expressing gratitude, because after all, if it wasn't for your ancestors, you would not be here. You would not exist, right? This is the same for East or West. And this idea is not foreign to our way of thinking. In the West, we have plenty of people who are fascinated with that same question. Where did I come from? What were my ancestors like? I want to find out more about them. Oh yeah, that's definitely a thing. Genealogy research, family tree research, websites that support them, even DNA analysis like 23andMe to talk about your genetic inheritance. There's also plenty of people, you know, they don't just go online and go to those websites that support research in genealogy. They don't just purchase a DNA analysis. They may also decide to travel abroad to seek one's ancestral roots. You know, you may have someone who travels back to Europe, maybe an Irish person, someone of Irish descent, travels back to Ireland to try to find out more about, hey, a long time ago, my ancestors came from here. So that's the idea. So let me use that common understanding to address the misconception. So I have a slide here. The title says, drink water, think of source. This is actually a very common expression in Mandarin, in Chinese. 饮水思源. Literally, the 4 characters translate to the English title that you see. First character is to drink. Second character means water. Third character is to think or to contemplate, to reflect upon. Yuan, last character, is the source of the water. So the wisdom is that you're not just drinking water, you're being mindful about where that water came from. This is used as a metaphor for thinking about your life and then considering, reflecting, contemplating where your life originated. So this expression is used where people in the West talk about ancestor worship as a misconception. I initially found out about this still a teenager at the time when I was going through a class on world religions. This class was taught by an elderly Catholic priest. So students in the class asked the teacher, why do Asians worship their ancestors? Now, this priest was extremely knowledgeable about Catholicism, but he did not really know, just like most people, he didn't really know about the background information, the foundation of Asian thought. So he said, he guessed. He said, I think maybe the Asian people were fearful of the spirits of their ancestors. So the ritual that was practiced in, ancestor worship was meant to placate them, so these spirits would not punish their descendants with some kind of curse. So I realized back then that this was a misunderstanding, but then subsequent to that, I also encountered more and more people who expressed the same ideas. That indicated the misconception was widespread. And someplace where I did not expect the misconception would show up was actually back in Taiwan. Now there, people knew that when they prayed to the ancestors, it was to express appreciation, gratitude. It was not a religious worship in the usual sense. But the people in Taiwan who had converted to Catholicism or Christianity followed the same ideas. They began to see this practice as religious or even superstitious. And some of them have been taught that all prayers not directed to God went to Satan. And therefore, ancestor worship was the equivalent to devil worship. And this was incredible to me because I saw this practice as a thing of beauty. I did not realize that it could be so distorted. And it's gotten to the point where people who have converted to Catholicism or Christianity, in homes where there are shrines set up for the ancestors, these people would refuse to go near the shrine. They would refuse to hold the incense sticks. They would even refuse to touch the food that had been prayed over. because everything associated with the ritual was tainted by the touch of the devil and therefore evil. And I even saw the same kind of ideas in books. So authors who, I sort of expected that they would do research. They would also write down similar concepts. So for instance, in one particular book, an author who was widely respected, a scientist, talked about irrational beliefs in the world. To illustrate his point, he pointed to ancient Chinese practices like, I Ching, fortune telling, and ancestor worship. So when I saw that, it stood out for me because it was also equating ancestor worship with something that was primitive, outdated, superstitious. So the distortion is pretty widespread. And now the opportunity is that I can say, have this be recorded in a YouTube video that, listen, it's about gratitude and respect. And when we talk about gratitude and respect, it's actually the highest echelon of human emotions. And the expression that you see in the slide, drink water, think of source, it is most close associated with the practice. The idea is to never ever take anything for granted. When you quench your thirst with the water, don't forget the spring or the well where the water came from. As you enjoy your life, don't forget the source of your life. Without that source, without the well, you will not be drinking deeply. Without the source of life, you will not be alive. So this is just not taking your existence for granted, and think about the lives that your ancestors lived. They fought, they struggled, they lived, they loved, they survived. Good thing they did, It makes perfect sense that if you cherish yourself, you would also cherish your forebears, the people who came before you, the people who paved the way for you. So then, back to the point here. This is how it ties in with chapter 54. We're not talking about how the descendants of someone who's establishing a Tao practice will be praying to you in the future so that you will not curse them. What we're saying is that they will be expressing their gratitude for you having set up a tradition that is proactive, that is positive, that contributes to life in a meaningful way. That's what we're really talking about. So there you go. That is my personal actual experience dealing with the concept of ancestor worship. And now I think that you guys will come away with a clearer notion what it is and isn't. So moving on, let's go to line 4. In fact, let's take a look at the common character from line 4 to line 5 and line 6. It actually goes even further beyond that, but we can just look at these 3, isolate the first character, Shou. So the pinyin looks a little funny, Xiu. Even if you know that the X is supposed to be like SH, you would still look at that and say Shu, but it's actually Shou. What does that mean? Well, it's got different definitions. Number 1, it can mean to repair, to fix something. Shouli, to correct, to change. Shougai. So shou can mean that. That's not what it means here. Number two, it can mean to study, to work toward an academic degree, to learn something. 修学位. So for instance, in this particular case, it's definitely number two rather than number one. When you study Tao teachings, you're working not toward an academic degree, but you are working toward a higher level of spirituality to elevate yourself, to cultivate the Tao, to make that elevation occur. So 修 is definitely cultivate in the context of studying or learning. Now we can take a look at this entire line. Cultivate it in yourself, its virtue shall be true. It, in this context, applies to the Tao. Cultivate the Tao in yourself. The virtue of the Tao shall be true. So first, let me isolate the last character there, 真. Here's the pinyin. So it's the closest that we can really come to in English. In Mandarin, 真. The meaning is true, real, genuine, authentic. So then when we put it all together, when we look at the entire line, cultivate it in yourself, its virtue shall be true. This is linking that which is true, that which is real, genuine, and authentic to Tao cultivation. So let's look at the entire line. What it's saying is that the only way to attain genuine virtue is to cultivate the self. Or flip it around the other way. Cultivate the self, attain real virtue, true virtue. So the focus of Tao cultivation is on the true self, your true essence. This is the connection between Tao cultivation, virtue, and that which is true or genuine or authentic. So let me show you what that looks like. This particular chapter is all about how the Tao spreads outward from the inside out, starting within the heart, radiating outward like a ripple. So here, in the middle of this diagram, that's the self. So the Chinese character for that, 身, physically, it means the body. Metaphysically, it means the essence of the self. So what we're saying in this line is that when you cultivate it in yourself, the virtue shall be true. And you have to use the truth for cultivation. Let's take a look at the next line. So same as before, what I'll do first is I'll isolate the last character to talk about what that means. In this case, 余, it means surplus or extras. This is a positive context in Chinese. So Chinese people would want surplus, extras, because that is a sign of abundant prosperity. Makes sense, right? Here, what it's saying is that if you were to cultivate the Tao in the family, the virtue of the Tao shall be abundant. So let's take a look at that. This is saying that you expand beyond yourself. You're going from self-cultivation to cultivating the Tao in the family. When you include the family, and remember, the definition of family could be yourself and your close friends who feel closer than family. It doesn't necessarily have to always be family by blood. When you include the family, you attain the personal level of abundance. Let me explain. Abundance in virtue that you attain when you cultivate beyond yourself is reflected in every aspect of family life. So I have a bullet point here that may make it a little easier to see. So the abundant virtue manifests also is reflected as abundant harmony in the home, abundance of love in the home, in the family, a strong bond within the family, the closeness of family members, the family being able to function as a cohesive unit, everybody pulling in the same direction. Also, a harmonious family is a prosperous family because family pulling together, work together for the common goal. That goal perhaps can be financial stability, less worries over material resources, etc. So there's a lot to be said for cultivating beyond yourself, and the first level beyond that is to expand into the family. In the diagram that you saw, here's how I represent that expansion. So beyond the self to the family, on top we have the character 家 for the family or the home, and then to the left, 余, I have the character for abundance, extras, surplus. The virtue shall be abundant. So this is the first level of expansion. So let's take a look at the level beyond that. I think you see exactly the direction that we're headed. We're looking at the words of Lao Tzu, and we're representing it visually to make it easier to understand. Cultivated in the community, its virtue shall be lasting. So as usual, what I'll do here is I'll isolate the very last character here, put it down here, 长. So pinyin, close enough, meaning long in terms of duration, in terms of time, therefore lasting. So if you cultivate it in the community, its virtue shall be long-lasting. That's what it's saying. So what does that mean? Well, when the Tao expands beyond your family, you influence your community in a positive way. The more people you influence, and this goes back to the concept that we talked about a little bit earlier, that when the Tao is spread to more and more people, it becomes ever more indestructible. It's an idea, it's a concept. The more people know about it, the more it is impossible to eradicate it. So more and more neighbors are affected by this, by the Tao, which will exert a lasting influence for the good. So more and more people are inspired, they get involved, they contribute to the common cause within the community, they all band together to work toward the common good. So that's exactly what that means. So we can now easily describe that as yet another level of expansion, as you can see here. So beyond the family, you expand into the community. We have the matching character there on top. The virtue will then be lasting because now more and more people are involved, not just your family, not just the people closest to you, your loved ones, it's neighbors. So is there more beyond? Well, of course. I think we'll do a couple more. Here, line 7 says, cultivated in the country, its virtue shall be prosperous. Let's look at the last character there, 丰. So the pinyin is a little misleading. It's supposed to sound like 丰, like 丰富, common expression. The meaning, affluent, bountiful. This is another way to express abundance and prosperity, except that now this is at a national level. No longer at the personal level, but involving an entire country or kingdom in ancient times. So here's the idea. When the Tao expands to an entire country, it brings prosperity at the national level. Let me note that this is rarely accomplished in the history of humanity. This has a lot of positive effects for a country, a nation, a state, a kingdom, an empire. It'll manifest as national wealth, international prestige, leadership role in the world, the high regard of other countries. So it is very beneficial to the country, but it is rarely accomplished. Most of the time, what countries do is that some countries can partially get closer to the Tao in a few aspects of its national discourse. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. For now, I just want to show the expansion into the next level, the level of the country, and then point out that the benefit is that the virtue shall be prosperous, abundance at the national level. As you can see, we now have one more level to go through before we complete the diagram. So I want to push ahead to get us to that point. It is line 8. Cultivated in the world, its virtue shall be widespread. So here, I want to single out the last character there, which, looking at the translation, you can easily guess. Pu means general, universal, everywhere, widespread. So a common character often used in Mandarin, even 普通话, just the common tongue. So very, very often used character. So here, what it's saying is that when the Tao expands into the whole world, if and when it expands to the whole world, it brings the greatest possible benefit to humanity as a whole. It has the greatest impact. Now, I think you know, and I know, that this is not a reality. It's an aspiration. It's something that has never occurred in the history of the world, perhaps in the distant future. It is a worthwhile goal. Whatever you and I can do to contribute to that goal, to get closer to that vision, is a worthy goal. Now, take a look at the completion of this diagram. You can now see that everything's filled in. You go from the self to the family, to the community, to the country, and finally to the world. And when it's spread to the world, truly the virtue is universal, it's everywhere, it's commonplace, it's widespread. So looking at the time, that's actually all the time we have today. We have to end on this note and then go to our summary for today. We're getting pretty close to the top of the hour. So let me remind everyone that last time we had part 1 summary that covered just the first couple of lines. We talked about letting the Tao take root deep within your heart. We talked about holding on to and embracing the Tao. And we started talking about bringing the Tao into your family to make things more harmonious. It's going to have far-reaching impact. And Lao Tzu says, hey, listen, future generations will be very thankful. So that was the summary from last time, part 1. Let's do the summary for what we talked about today. We talked about not just expanding into the family, but also expanding to the community. Here, I want to ask everyone to take a very broad and general definition of community and think about your online community, a group that you belong to. And community beyond your immediate family can also be your extended family. It can be not just your closest friends, but your expanded social circle. Perhaps the workplace, co-workers, and so on. These are possible targets for sharing. There may be someone out there belonging to one of those that can really use the Tao that you have to share with them. We also talked about number 5, let the Tao expand into the country. So this in ancient times would have been difficult for the individual. Today, though, it's made easier through technology. We all have access to social media. We all have the ability to send our message out there far and wide. If you are interested in helping to spread the message of the Tao, there are little things that you can do right away. And when people ask me that question, ask for specifics, I tell them that it can be as simple as going to Amazon, look up my books, and then type in a review to help spread the message. Even that can be very helpful. So technology is our friend. And then finally, spread the message of the Tao in the world. As I said, this has never happened in the history of humanity. There hasn't been a global golden age for the Tao. The Tao today remains relatively unknown, which on the flip side, when you look at the yin and yang complementary duality, it also means that there are many opportunities for sharing the Tao. And remember, whatever effort you put into it, it can mean the world to someone out there. So the meaning of this last bullet here becomes even more apparent later on in this chapter. I'm looking forward to that discussion. But you don't need to change the entire world, but you definitely have the ability to change somebody's world. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.